Today I'm going to be doing an example of a positive demand shock. So first we need to draw our graph. It's the ADAS model. We're going to label the y-axis with P and the x-axis with Y. Then we need to draw our three lines. The yellow line is going to be long-run aggregate supply. Purple is short-run aggregate supply. And then the green is aggregate demand. Then we are going to move on to labeling some points. So we're going to start with E1, where all the lines intersect, and then we are going to label Y star, and then we are going to label P. So on this graph, E1 is going to stand for the initial long-run equilibrium. Then we are going to choose a factor that would shift the aggregate demand line. So one example is possibly housing pricing increasing. So we're just going to put that. And then this would cause the wealth to increase. And then if wealth were to increase, this would increase consumption, which is a factor of aggregate demand, which would shift aggregate demand to the right. It would make it increase. So to label this on the graph, you're just going to put two arrows showing which way the aggregate demand curve is shifting. In this case, it's going to be to the right. And then just drawing another line on the graph. And then once you've drawn this line, you'll label this line aggregate demand 2, just so we can differentiate between the two. Now, once you have this line drawn, you're going to mark the new equilibrium, the new output, and the new price. So Y2 is going to be the new output. And then P2 is going to be the new price. And then once you have that drawn, E2 is going to equal the new short-run equilibrium. And then you can see as well that P2 is greater than P1, and that output 2 is greater than the initial output. And this tells us that the economy is in an economic boom. So now that we've labeled and shown the short-run effects of a demand shock, we need to move on to showing what it would look like in the long run. So you're just going to draw out the same graph with the same labels on the axis, and then the short run and long run supply curves. And then the aggregate demand curve, you're going to want to use aggregate demand curve 2 from the last graph. And then you can just go ahead and label these long run, short run, and then AD2. And then just go ahead and label all the same points just to keep it organized so you remember where everything was, E1 and E2, and then initial output, output 2, initial price, and then price 2. And those are all short run effects. Now, once you have those, we know that an economic boom is going to cause a increase in demand for factors of production. So you have that written out. And then with an increase in demand for factors of production, this is then going to cause the prices for materials of production to increase. Or you could also say prices of inputs to increase. And then this is going to cause the short run aggregate supply curve to shift to the left, or decrease. So to show this on the graph, you will look at the RAS curve and you want to label it moving it to the left, and then draw a new curve. And then you want to label this one short run aggregate supply curve 2. And then once you have this labeled, you can see where the new equilibrium is. And then you can label this point E3. And then the new output Y3 and the new price will be P3. So with this graph, you can see that E3 is the new long run equilibrium. So price 3 is greater than price 1. And then output 3 is equal to output 1. And it's also equal to the initial output or potential output. This now shows us that we are back in equilibrium. We can also notice that the long run aggregate supply curve does not shift when a demand shock occurs.